Tonight I will be reading from the MAIDA book series by Inez Haynes Irwin, published in 1909. The story is about a sweet little girl named Maida who is sickly and lame. Her father is well known to be one of the most wealthiest men in America. He decides to buy her a little shop in Charleston, Massachusetts, to give her a purpose and to help restore her health. However, he has one condition: that she not tell anyone who she is or who her father is. And for the first time in her life, Maida makes wonderful new friends because they think she's just an ordinary girl. And so, as always, my friend, settling comfortably under the covers, take a slow, comfortable breath. And as you exhale, relax and let go. Allow any tension to just melt away, letting your body sink deeper and deeper down into the softness of your bed. There is nothing left to do and nowhere else to be. So just lay back, relax, and enjoy the story. Chapter 7. Trouble. The next week was a week of trouble for Maida. Everything seemed to go wrong from the first tinkle of the bell Monday morning to the last tinkle Saturday night. It began with a conversation. Rosie came marching in early Monday, head up, eyes flaming. "Maida," she began at once, in her quickest, briskest tone, "I've got something to tell you. Laura Lathrop came over to Dickie's house the other day while the WMNTs were meeting, and she told us the greatest mess of stuff about you. Laura said that you said that last summer you had a birthday party that you invited 500 children to. She said that you said that you had a maypole at this party, and a fish pond, and a Punch and Judy show, and all sorts of things. She said that you had a big dollhouse and a little theater all your own. I said that I didn't believe that you told her all that. Did you?" "Oh, yes, I told her that, and more," Maida answered directly. "Laura said it was all a pack of lies, but I don't believe that. Is it all true?" "It's all true," Maida said. Rosie looked at her hard. "You know, Maida," she went on after a while, "you told me about a lot of birds and animals that your father had. I thought he kept a bird place. But Dickie says you told him that your father had 12 peacocks, not in a store, but in a place where he lives." She paused and looked inquiringly at Maida. Maida answered the look. "Yes, I told him that." "And it's all true?" Rosie asked again. "Yes, it's all true," Maida repeated. Rosie hesitated a moment. "Harold Lathrop says that you're daffy." Maida said nothing. "Arthur Duncan says," Rosie went on more timidly, "that you probably dreamed those things." Still, Maida said nothing. "Do you think you did dream them, Maida?" Maida smiled. "No, I didn't dream them. Well, I thought of another thing, Rosie went on eagerly. Miss Allison told Mother that Granny told her that you'd been sick for a long time. And I thought maybe you were out of your head and imagined those things. Oh, Maida, Rosie's voice actually coaxed her to favor this theory. Don't you think you imagined them? Maida laughed. No, Rosie, she said in her quietest voice. I did not imagine them. For a moment, neither of the two little girls spoke, but they stared a little defiantly into each other's eyes. What did Dickie say? Maida asked after a while. Oh, Dickie said he would believe anything you told him, no matter what it was. Dickie says he believes you're a princess in disguise, like in fairy tales. Dear, dear Dickie, Maida said. He was the first friend I made in Primrose Court, and I guess he's the best one. Well, I guess I'm your friend, Rosie said, firing up. I told that little smarty cat of a Laura if she ever said one word against you, I'd slap her good and hard. Only it seems strange that a little girl who's just like the rest of us should have storybook things happening to her all the time. If it's true, then fairy tales are true. She paused and looked at Maida straight in the eye. I can't believe it, Maida, but I know you believe it, and that's all there is to it. But you'd better believe I'm your friend. Saying which, she marched out. Maida's second trouble began that night. It had grown dark. Suddenly, without any warning, the door of the shop flew open. For an instant, 3 or 4 voices filled the place with their yells. Then the door shut. Nothing was heard but the sound of running feet. Granny and Maida rushed to the door. Nobody was in sight. Who was it? What does it mean, Granny? Maida asked in bewilderment. Only naughty boys teasing you, Granny explained. Maida had hardly seated herself when the performance was repeated. Again, she rushed to the door. Again, she saw nobody. The third time, she did not stir from her chair. Tuesday night, the same thing happened. Who the boys were, Maida could not find out. Why they bothered her, she could not guess. Take no notice of it, my lamb, Granny counseled. When they find you pay no attention to it, they'll be stopping. Maida followed Granny's advice, but the annoyance did not cease, and she began to dread the twilight. She made up her mind that she must put an end to it soon. She knew she could stop it at once by appealing to Billy Potter, and yet, somehow, she did not want to ask for outside help. She had a feeling of pride about handling her own troubles. One afternoon, Laura came into the shop. It was the first time that Maida had seen her since the afternoon of her call, and Maida did not speak. She felt that she could not have anything to do with Laura after what had happened. But she looked straight at Laura and waited. Laura did not speak either. She looked at Maida as if she had never seen her before. She carried her head at its highest, and she moved across the room with her most important air. As she stood a moment, gazing at the things in the showcase, she had never seemed more patronizing. "A cent's worth of dulce, please," she said airily. "Dulce?" Maida repeated, questioningly. "I guess I haven't any. What is dulce?" "Haven't any dulce?" Laura repeated, with an appearance of being greatly shocked. "Do you mean to say you haven't any dulce?" Maida did not answer. She put her lips tight together. "This is a healthy shop. Laura went on in a sneering tone. No malolagobs, no apple on the stick, no tamarinds, no popcorn balls, no dulse. Why don't you sell the things we want? Half the children in the neighborhood are going down to the main street to get them now. She bustled out of the shop. Maida stared after her with wide, alarmed eyes. For a moment, she did not stir. Then she ran into the living room and buried her face in Granny's lap, bursting into tears. "Oh, Granny," she sobbed. "Laura Lathrop says that half the children don't like my shop, and they're going down to Main Street to buy things. What shall I do? What shall I do?" There, Akeshla," Granny said soothingly, taking the trembling little girl onto her lap. "Don't worry about anything that wand says. 'Tis a fine little shop you have, as all the grown folks say." "But Granny," Maida protested passionately, "I don't want to please the grown people. I want to please the children. And Papa said I must make the store pay. And now I'm afraid I never will. Oh, what shall I do?" She got no further. A tinkle of the bell, followed by pattering footsteps, interrupted. In an instant, Rosie, brilliant in her scarlet cape and scarlet hat, with cheeks and lips the color of cherries, stood at her side. "I saw that hateful Laura come out of here," she said. "I just knew she'd come in to make trouble. What did she say to you?" Maida told her slowly between her sobs. "Horrid little smarty cat," was Rosie's comment, and she scowled until her face looked like a thundercloud. "I shall never speak to her again," Maida declared fervently. "But what shall I do about it, Rosie? It may be true what she said." "Now don't you get discouraged, Maida," Rosie said, "because I can tell you just how to get or make those things Laura spoke of." "Oh, can you, Rosie? What would I do without you? I'll put everything down in a book so that I won't forget them." She limped over to the desk. There the black head bent over the golden one. "What is a dulse?" Maida demanded first. "Don't you know what dulse is?" Rosie asked incredulously. "Maida, you are the strangest child. The commonest things you don't know anything about. And yet I suppose if I asked you if you'd seen a flying machine, you'd say you had." "I have," Maida answered instantly, "in Paris." Rosie's face wrinkled into its most perplexed look. She changed the subject at once. "Well, dulse is a purple stuff. When you see a lot of it together, it looks as if a million toy balloons had burst. It's all wrinkled up and tastes salty." Maida thought hard for a moment. Then she burst into laughter, although the big round teardrops were still hanging from the tips of her lashes. "There was a whole drawerful here when I first came. I remember now. I thought it was waste stuff and threw it all away." Rosie laughed too. "The tamarinds you can get from the man who comes round with the wagon. Mrs. Murdoch used to make her own apples on the stick, malolagobs, and cornballs. I've helped her many a time. Now I'll write you a list of stuff to order from the grocer. I'll come around after school and we'll make a batch of all those things. Tonight you get Billy to print a sign, apples on the stick, and malolagobs today. You put that in the window tomorrow morning, and by tomorrow night you'll be all sold out." "Oh, Rosie," Maida said happily, "I shall be so much obliged to you." Rosie was as good as her word. She appeared that afternoon wearing a long-sleeved apron under the scarlet cape. It seemed to Maida that she worked like lightning, for she made batch after batch of candy, moving as capably above the stove as an experienced cook. In the meantime, Maida was popping corn at the fireplace. They mounted 50 apples on skewers and dipped them, one at a time, into the boiling candy. They made 30 corn balls and 25 lollygobbs, which turned out to be round chunks of candy stuck on the end of sticks. "I never did see such clever children anywhere as there are in Primrose," Maida said that night with a sigh to Granny. "Rosie told me that she could make 6 kinds of candy, and Dickie can cook as well as his mother. They make me feel so useless. Why, Granny, I can't do a single thing that's any good to anybody." The next day the shop was crowded. By night there was not an apple, a cornball, or lollyglob left. "I shall have a sale like this once a week in the future," Maida said. "Granny, lots and lots of children came here who'd never been in the shop before." And so, what looked like serious trouble ended very happily. Trouble number 3 was a great deal more serious, and it did not at first promise to end well at all. It had to do with Arthur Duncan. It had been going on for a week before Maida mentioned it to anybody, but it haunted her very dreams. Early Monday morning, Arthur came into the shop. In his usual gruff voice and with his usual surly manner, he said, "Show me some of those rubbers in the window." Maida took out a handful of rubbers, 5 she thought, and put them on the counter. While Arthur looked them over, she turned to replace a paper doll which she had knocked down. "Guess I won't take one today," Arthur said, while her back was still turned, and walked out. When Maida put the rubbers back, she discovered that there were only 4. She made up her mind that she had not counted right and thought no more of the incident. 2 days later, Arthur Duncan came in again. Maida had just been selling some pencils, pretty striped ones with a blue stone in the end. 3 of them were left lying on the counter. Arthur asked her to show him some pen holders. Maida took 3 from the shelves back of her. He bought one of these. After he had gone, she discovered that there were only 2 pencils left on the counter. One of them must have rolled off, Maida thought. But although she looked everywhere, she could not find it. The incident of the rubber occurred to her. She felt a little troubled, but she resolved to put both circumstances out of her mind. A day or 2 later, Arthur Duncan came in for the 3rd time. It happened that Granny was out marketing. Piled on the counter was a stack of blank books. Pretty books they were, with a child's head in color on the cover. Arthur asked for letter paper. Maida turned back to the shelf. With her hand on the sliding door, she stopped, half stunned. Reflected in the glass, she saw Arthur Duncan stow one of the blank books away in his pocket. Maida felt sick all over. She did not know what to do. She did not know what to say. She fumbled with trembling hands among the things on the shelf. She dreaded to turn for fear her face would express what she had seen. Perhaps he'll pay for it, she thought. I hope he will. But Arthur made no offer to pay. He looked over the letter paper that Maida, with downcast eyes, put before him, decided that he did not want any after all, and walked coolly from the shop. Granny, coming in a few moments later, was surprised to find Maida leaning on the counter, her face buried in her hands. "What's the matter with my lamb?" the old lady asked cheerfully. "Nothing, Granny," Maida said, but she did not meet Granny's eye, and during dinner she was quiet and serious. That night, Billy Potter called. "Well, "How goes the Bon Marché of Charleston?" he asked cheerfully. "Billy," Maida said gravely, "if you found that a little boy, I can't say what his name is, was stealing from you, what would you do?" Billy considered the question as gravely as she had asked it. "Tell the policeman on the beat and get him to throw a scare into him," he said at last. "I guess that's what I'll have to do," but Maida's tone was mournful. But Granny interrupted. "Don't you do it, my lamb. Don't you do it." She turned to both of them. They had never seen her blue eyes so fiery before. "Suppose you were one of these poor children that always had potatoes for their meals and hunger for their pillow. Wouldn't you steal too if nobody was looking?" Neither Billy nor Maida spoke for a moment. "I guess Granny's right," Billy said finally. "I guess she is," Maida said with a sigh. It was 3 days before Arthur Duncan came into the shop again. But in the meantime, Maida went one afternoon to play with Dickie. Dickie was drawing at a table when Maida came in. She glanced at his work. He was using a striped pencil with a blue stone in its end, a blank book with the picture of the little girl on the cover, a rubber of a kind very familiar to her. Maida knew certainly that Dickie had bought none of these things from her. She knew as certainly that they were the things that Arthur Duncan had stolen. What was the explanation of the mystery? She went to bed that night miserably unhappy. Her heart beat pit-a-pat the next time she saw Arthur open the door. She folded her hands close together so that he should not see that she was trembling. She began to wish that she had followed Billy's advice. It happened again. It occurred to her that it was, perhaps, too serious a situation for a little girl to deal with. She had made up her mind that when Arthur was in the shop, she would not turn her back to him. She was determined not to give him the chance to fall into temptation. But he asked for pencil sharpeners, and pencil sharpeners were kept in the lower drawer. There was nothing for her to do but to get down on the floor. She remembered, with a sense of relief, that she had left no stock out on the counter. She knelt upright on the floor, seeking for the box. Suddenly, reflected in the glass door, she saw another terrifying picture. Arthur Duncan's arm was just closing the money drawer. For an instant, Maida felt so sick at heart that she wanted to run back into the living room, throw herself into Granny's big chair, and cry her eyes out. Then suddenly, all this weakness went. A feeling, such as she had never known, came into its place. She was still angry, but she was singularly cool. She felt no more afraid of Arthur Duncan than of the bowl of dahlias blooming on the counter. She whirled around in a flash and looked him straight in the eye. "If there's anything in this shop that you want so much that you are willing to steal, tell me what it is and I'll give it to you," she said. What are you talking about?" Arthur demanded. He attempted to outstare her. But Maida kept her eyes steadily on his. "You know what I'm talking about well enough," she said quietly. "In the last week, you've stolen a rubber and a pencil and a blank book from me, and just now you tried to take some money from the money drawer." Arthur sneered. "How are you going to prove it?" he asked impudently. Maida was so angry, but something inside warned her that she must not give way to her temper. For all her life, she had been accustomed to think before she spoke. Indeed, she herself had never been driven or scolded. Her father had always reasoned with her. Doctors and nurses had always reasoned with her. Even Granny had always reasoned with her. So now, she thought very carefully before she spoke again, but she kept her eyes fixed on Arthur. His eyes did not move from hers, but in some curious way, she knew that he was uneasy. "I can't prove it," she said at last, "and I hadn't any idea of trying to. I'm only warning you that you must not come in here if you're not to be trusted. And I told you the truth when I said I would rather give you anything in the shop than have you steal it, for I think you must need those things very badly to be willing to get them that way. I don't believe anybody wants to steal. Now when you want anything so bad as that, come to me and I'll see if I can get it for you." Arthur stared at her as if he had not a word on his tongue. "If you think you can frighten me," he said. Then, without ending his sentence, he swaggered out of the shop. But to Maida, his swagger seemed like something put on to conceal another feeling. Maida suddenly felt very tired. She wished that Granny Flynn would come back. She wanted Granny to take her into her lap, to cuddle her, to tell her some merry little tale of Irish fairies. But instead, the bell rang and another customer came in. While she was waiting on her, Maida noticed somebody coming up to the window, look in, and then duck down. She wondered if it must be Billy playing one of his games on her. The customer went out. In a few moments, the bell tinkled again. Maida had been leaning against the counter, her tired head on her outstretched arms. She looked up. It was Arthur Duncan. He strode straight over to her. "Here's 3 cents for your rubber," he said, "and 5 for your pencil. 5 for the blank book, and there's 2 dimes I took out of the money drawer." Maida did not know what to say. The tears came to her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. Arthur shifted his weight from one foot to the other in intense embarrassment. "I didn't know it would make you feel as bad as that," he said. "I don't feel bad," Maida sobbed, and to prove it, she smiled while the tears ran down her cheeks. "I feel glad." What he would have answered to this she never knew, for at that moment the door flew open. The little rowdy boys who had been troubling her so much lately let out a series of blood-curdling yells. "What's that?" Arthur asked. "I don't know who they are," Maida said wearily, "but they do that 3 or 4 times every night. I don't know what to do about it." "Well, I do," Arthur said. "You wait." He went over to the door and waited, flattening himself against the wall. After a long silence, they could hear footsteps tiptoeing on the bricks outside. The door flew open. Arthur Duncan leaped like a cat through the opening. There came back to Maida the sound of running, then a pause, then another sound very much as if 2 or 3 naughty little heads were being vigorously knocked together. She heard Arthur say, "Let me catch one of you doing that again, and I'll lick you till you can't stand up. And remember, I'll be watching for you every night now." Maida did not see him again then, but just before dinner the bell rang. When Maida opened the door, there stood Arthur. "I had this kitten, and I thought you might like him," he said awkwardly, holding out a little bundle of gray fluff. "Want it?" "Want it?" Maida said. She seized it eagerly. "Oh, thank you, Arthur, ever so much. Oh, Granny, look at this darling Kit Kat. What a ball of fluff he is. I'll call him Fluff. And he isn't a prize kitty of any kind, just a beautiful plain everyday cat, the kind I've always wanted." Even this was not all. After dinner, the shop bell rang again. This time it was Arthur and Rosie. Rosie's lips were very tight, as if she had made up her mind to some bold deed, but her flashing eyes showed excitement. "Can we see you alone for a moment, Maida?" she asked in her most businesslike tones. Wondering, Maida shut the door to the living room and came back to them. "Maida," Rosie began, "Arthur told me all about the rubber and the pencil and the blank book and the dimes. Of course, I felt pretty bad when I heard about it, but I wanted Arthur to come right over here and explain the whole thing to you. You see, Arthur took those things to give away to Dickie because Dickie has such a hard time getting anything he wants." "Yes, I saw them over at Dickie's," Maida said. "And then there was a great deal more to it that Arthur's just told me, and I thought you ought to know it at once. You see, Arthur's father belongs to a club that meets once a month, and Arthur goes there a lot with him. And those men think that plenty of people have things that they have no right to, like automobiles, things that they haven't earned. And the men in Mr. Duncan's club say that it's perfectly right to take things away from people who have too much and give them to people who have too little. But I say that might be all right for grown people, but when children do it, it's just plain stealing. And that's all there is to it. But I wanted you to know that Arthur thought it was right. Well, sort of right, you understand, when he took those things. You don't think so now, do you, after the talking I've given to you?" She turned severely on Arthur. Arthur shuffled and looked embarrassed. "No," he said sheepishly, "not until you're grown up." "But what I wanted to say next, Maida," Rosie continued, "is please not to tell Dickie. He would be so surprised, and then he wouldn't keep the things that Arthur gave him. And of course, now that Arthur has paid for them, they're all right for him to have." "Of course I wouldn't tell anybody," Maida said in a shocked voice. "Not even Granny or Billy, not even my father." "Then that's settled," Rosie said with a sigh. "Good night." The next day, the following note reached Maida. "You are cordially invited to join the WMNT Club, which meets 3 times a week at the house of Miss Rosie Brine or Mr. Richard Dorr or Mr. Arthur Duncan. P.S. The name means we must never tell." Maida dreamed nothing but happy dreams that night. Chapter 8. A Rainy Day. The next day, it rained dismally. Maida had been running the shop for 3 weeks, but this was her first experience with stormy weather. Because she, herself, had never been allowed to set her foot outdoors when the weather was damp, she expected that she would see no children that day. But long before the bell rang, they crowded in wet, streaming groups into the shop. And at 9, the lines disappearing into the big school doorways seemed as long as ever. Even the Clark twins in rubber boots, long rain capes, and a baby umbrella came in to spend their daily pennies. "I guess it'll be one session, Maida," Dorotha whispered. "Oh, goody, Dorothy," Mabel lisped. "Don't you love one session, Maida?" Maida was ashamed to confess to such tiny girls that she did not know what one session meant, but she puzzled over it the whole morning. If Rosie and Arthur had come in, she would have asked them, but neither of them appeared. Indeed, they were not anywhere in the lines. Maida looked very carefully. At 12 o'clock, the school bell did not ring. In surprise, Maida craned out of the window to consult the big church clock. It agreed exactly with the tall grandfather's clock in the living room. Both pointed to 12, then to 5 minutes after, and 10 and 15. Still no bell. A little later, Dickie came swinging along, the sides of his old rusty raincoat flapping like the wings of some great bird. It's one session, Maida, he said excitedly. Did you hear the bell? What's one session, Dickie? Maida asked. Why, when it's too stormy for the children to go to school in the afternoon, the fire bells ring 22 at 11:45. They keep all the classes in until 1 o'clock, though. Oh, that's why they don't come out, Maida said. At 1 o'clock, the umbrellas began to file out of the school door. The street looked as if it had grown a monster crop of shiny black toadstools. But it was the only sign of life that the neighborhood showed for the rest of the day. The storm was too violent for even the big boys and girls to brave. A very long afternoon went by. Not a customer came into the shop. Maida felt very lonely. She wandered from shop to living room and from living room to chamber. She tried to read. She sewed a little. She even popped corn for a lonesome 15 minutes. But it seemed as if the long dark day would never go. As they were sitting down to dinner that night, Billy bounced in. His face pink and wet, his eyes sparkling like diamonds from his conflict with the winds. "Oh, Billy, how glad I am to see you," Maida said. "It's been the lonesomest day." "Sure, the sight of you's grand for sore eyes," said Granny. Maida had noticed that Billy's appearance always made the greatest difference in everything. Before he came, the noise of the wind howling about the store made Maida sad. Now it seemed the jolliest of sounds. And when at 7 Rosie appeared, Maida's cup of happiness brimmed over. While Billy talked with Granny, the two little girls rearranged the stock. "My mother was awful mad with me just before supper," Rosie began at once. "It seems as if she was so cross lately that there's no living with her. She picks on me all the time. That's why I'm here. She sent me to bed. But I made up my mind I wouldn't go to bed. I climbed out of my bedroom window and came over here." "Oh, Rosie, I wish you wouldn't do that," Maida said. "Oh, do run right home. Think how worried your mother would be if she went up into your room and found you gone. She wouldn't know what had become of you." "Well, then, what makes her so strict with me?" Rosie cried. Her eyes had grown as black as thunderclouds. The scowl that made her face so sullen had come deep between her eyebrows. "Oh, how I wish I had a mother," Maida said longingly. "I guess I wouldn't say a word to her, no matter how strict she was." "I guess you don't know what you'd do until you tried it," Rosie said. Granny and Billy had been curiously quiet in the other room. Suddenly, Billy Potter stepped to the door. "I've just thought of a great game, children," he said. "But we've got to play it in the kitchen. Bring some crayons, Maida." The children raced after him. "What is it?" they asked in chorus. Billy did not answer. He lifted Granny's easy chair with Granny, knitting and all, and placed it in front of the kitchen stove. Then he began to draw a huge rectangle on the clean stone floor. "Guess," he said. "Sure, and I know what it's going to be," smiled Granny. Maida and Rosie watched him closely. Suddenly, they both shouted together, "Hopscotch! Hopscotch!" "Right you are," Billy approved. He searched among the coals on the hob until he found a hard piece of slate. "All right now," he said briskly. "Your turn first, Rosie, because you're company." Rosie failed at 5Z. Maida's turn came next, and she failed on 3Z. Billy followed Maida, but he hopped on the line on 2Z. "I believe I could play that game, old as I am," Granny said suddenly. I bet you could, Billy said. Sure, I was a fine player, I was, when I was a little girl. Come on, Granny, Billy said. The two little girls jumped up and down, clapping their hands and shrieking, Granny's gonna play! Granny's gonna play! They made so much noise finally that Billy had to threaten to stand them on their heads in a corner. Granny took her turn after Billy. She hopped about like a very active and very benevolent old fairy. Oh, doesn't she look like the dame in fairy tales? Maida said. They played for a half an hour, and who do you suppose won? Not Maida, with all her newfound strength. Not Rosie, with all her nervous energy. Not Billy, with all his athletic training. Mrs. Delia Flynn, champion of America and Ireland, Billy greeted the victor. Granny, we'll have to enter you in the next Olympic Games. They returned after this breathless work to the living room. Now I'm going to tell you a story, Billy announced. Oh, Maida squealed. Do. Billy tells the most wonderful stories, Rosie. Stories he's heard and stories he's read, but the most wonderful ones are those that he makes up as he goes along. The two little girls settled themselves on the hearthrug at Billy's feet. Granny sat not far off, working with double speed at her neglected knitting. Once upon a time, Billy said, there lived a little girl named Clara, and Clara was the naughtiest little girl in the world. She was a pretty child and a clever child, and everyone would have loved her if she had only given them a chance. But how can you love a child who is doing naughty things all the time? Particularly was she a great trial to her mother. That poor lady was not well and needed care and attention herself. But instead of giving her these, Clara gave her only hard words and disobedient acts. The mother used sometimes to punish her little daughter, but it seemed as if this only made her worse. Both father and mother were in despair about her. Clara seemed to be growing steadily worse and worse, and, indeed, lately, she had added to her naughtiness by threatening to run away. One night it happened. Clara had been so bad that her mother had put her to bed early. The moment her mother left the room, Clara whipped over to the window. I'm going to dress myself and climb out of the window and run away and never come back, she said to herself. The house in which Clara lived was built on the side of a cliff overlooking the sea. As Clara stood there in her nightgown, the moon began to rise and come up out of the water. Now the moonrise is always a beautiful sight, and Clara stopped for a moment to watch it, fascinated. It seemed to her that she had never seen the moon look so big before, and certainly she had never seen it such a color, a soft, deep orange. In fact, it might have been an immense orange, or better, a monster pumpkin stuck on the horizon line. The strange thing about the moon, though, was that it grew larger instead of smaller. It rose higher and higher, growing bigger and bigger, until it was halfway up the curve of the sky. Then it stopped short. Clara watched it, her eyes bulging out of her head. In all her experience, she had never seen such a surprising thing. And while she watched, another remarkable thing happened. A great door in the moon opened suddenly, and there on the threshold stood a little old lady. A strange little old lady she was. A little old lady with short red skirts and high, gaily flowered draperies at her waist. A little old lady with a tall, black sugar-loaf hat, a great white ruff around her neck, and little red shoes with bright silver buckles on them. A little old lady who carried a black cat perched on one shoulder and a broomstick on one hand. The little old lady stooped down and lifted something over the threshold. Clara strained her eyes to see what it was. It looked like a great roll of golden carpeting. With a sudden deft movement, the little old lady threw it out of the door. It flew straight across the ocean, unrolling as swiftly as a ball of twine that you flung across the room. It came nearer and nearer. The farther it got from the moon, the faster it unrolled. After a while, it struck against the shore right under Clara's window, and Clara saw it was the wake of the moon. She watched. The little old lady had disappeared from the doorway in the moon, but the door did not close. And suddenly, still another wonderful thing happened. The golden wake lifted itself gradually from the water until it was level with Clara's window. Bending down, she touched it with both her soft little hands. It was as firm and hard as if it had been woven from strands of gold. "Now's my time to run away from my cross mother," Clara said to herself. "I guess that nice old lady in the moon wants me to come and be her little girl. Well, I'll go. I guess they'll be sorry in the house tomorrow when they wake up and find they're never going to see me again." Opening the window gently that nobody might hear her, she stepped onto the wake of gold. It felt cool and hard to her little bare feet. It inclined gently from her window. She ran down the slope until she reached the edge of the sea. There she hesitated. For a moment, it seemed a daring thing to walk straight out to the moon, with nothing between her and the water but a path of gold. Then she recalled how her mother had sent her to bed, and her heart hardened. She started briskly out. From Clara's window, it had looked as though it would take her only a few moments to get to the moon. But the farther she went, the farther from her the doorway seemed to go. But she did not mind that the walk was so long, because it was so pretty. Looking over the edge of the wake of gold, deep down into the water, she could see all kinds of strange sights. At one place, a school of little fish swam up to the surface of the water. Clara knelt down and watched their pretty, graceful motions. The longer she gazed, the more fish she saw, and the more beautiful they seemed. Pale blue fishes with silver spots, pale pink ones with golden stripes, gorgeous red ones with jeweled black horns, brilliant yellow and green ones that shone like phosphorus. And here and there, gliding among them, were what seemed little angelfish, like living rainbows, whose filmy wing-like fins changed color when they swam. Clara reached into the water and tried to catch some of these marvelous beings. But at her first motion, bing! The water looked as if it were streaked with rainbow lightning. Swish! It was dull and clear again, with nothing between her and the quiet seaweed-covered bottom. A little farther along, Clara came across a wonderful sea grotto. Again, she knelt down on the wake of gold and watched. At the bottom, the sand was so white and shiny that it might have been made of stardust. Growing up from it were beds of marvelous sea flowers, opening and shutting delicate petals, beautiful sea fans that waved with every ripple, high, thick shrubs and towering trees in which the fishes had built their nests. In and out among all this undergrowth frisked tiny seahorses, ridden by mischievous sea urchins. They leaped and trotted and galloped as if they were so happy that they did not know what to do. Clara felt that she must play with them. She put one little foot in the water to attract their attention. Bing! The water seemed alive with scuttling things. Swish! The grotto was so quiet that she could not believe that there was anything living in it. A little farther on, Clara came upon a sight even more wonderful than this. A village of mer people. It was set so far down in the water that it seemed 1,000,000 miles away, and yet the water was so clear that she felt she could touch the housetops. The mer houses seemed to be made of a beautiful, sparkling white coral with big, wide-open windows through which the tide drifted. The mer streets seemed to be cobbled in pearl, the sidewalks to be paved in gold. At their sides grew mer trees, the highest she had ever seen, with all kinds of beautiful singing fish roosting in their branches. Little mer boats of carved pink coral with purple seaweed sails, or of mother of pearl with rosy mer flower petal sails, were floating through the streets. In some sat little mermaidens, the sunlight flashing on their pretty green scales, on their long golden tresses, on the bright mirrors they held in their hands. Other boats held little mer boys who made beautiful music on the harps they carried. At one end of the mer village, Clara could see one palace, bigger and more beautiful than all the others. Through an open window, she caught a glimpse of the mer king, a jolly old fellow with a fat red face and a long white beard sitting on a throne of gold. At his side reclined the mer queen, a very beautiful lady with a skin as white as milk and eyes as green as emeralds. Little mer princes and little mer princesses were playing on the floor with tiny mer kittens and tinier mer puppies. One sweet little mer baby was tip-tailing towards the window with a pearl that she had stolen from her sister's coronet. It seemed to Clara that this mer village was the most enchanting place that she had ever seen in her life. Oh, how she wanted to live there. "Oh, good mer king," she called entreatingly, "and good mer queen, please let me come to live in your palace." Bing! The water rustled and roiled as if all the birds of paradise that the world contained had taken flight. Swish! It was perfectly quiet again. The mer village was as deserted as a graveyard. "Well, if they don't want me, they shan't get me," Clara said, and she walked on twice as proud. By this time, she was getting closer and closer to the moon. The nearer she came, the bigger it grew. Now it filled the entire sky. The door had remained open all this time. Through it, she could see a garden more beautiful than any fairy tale garden that she had ever read about. From the doorway, silvery paths stretched between hedges as high as a giant's head. Sometimes these paths ended in fountains whose spray twisted into all kinds of fairy-like shapes. Sometimes These paths seemed to stop flush against the clouds. Near stretched flower beds so brilliant that you would have thought a kaleidoscope had broken on the ground. Birds, like living jewels, flew in and out through the tree branches. They sang so hard that it seemed to Clara that they must burst their little throats. From the branches hung all kinds of precious stones, all kinds of delicious-looking fruits and candies. Clara could not scramble through the door quickly enough, but as she put one foot on the threshold, the little old lady appeared. She looked as if she had stepped out of a fairy tale, and yet Clara had a strange feeling of discomfort when she looked at her. It seemed to Clara that the old lady's mouth was cruel and her eyes hard. "Are you the little girl who's run away?" the old lady asked. "Yes," Clara faltered. "And you want to live in the kingdom of the moon?" "Yes." "Enter, then." The old lady stepped aside, and Clara marched across the threshold. She felt the door swinging to behind her. She heard a bang as it closed, shutting her out of the world and into the moon. And then, what do you think happened? Billy stopped for a moment. Rosie and Maida rose to their knees. "What happened?" they asked breathlessly. The garden vanished, as utterly as if it were a broken soap bubble. Gone were the trees and the flowers. Gone were the fountains and the birds. Gone, too, were the jewels, the candies, and the fruits. The place had become a huge, dreary waste, stretching as far as Clara could see into the distance. It seemed to her as if all the trash that the world had outgrown had been dumped here. It was so covered with heaps of old rubbish. Clara turned to the old lady. She had not changed except that her cruel mouth sneered. Clara burst into tears. "I want to go home," she screamed. "Let me go back to my mother." The old lady only smiled. "You open that door and let me go back to my mother," Clara cried passionately. "But I can't open it," the old lady said. "It's locked. I have no keys." "Where are the keys?" Clara asked. The old lady pointed to the endless heaps of rubbish. "There, somewhere," she said. "I'll find them," Clara screamed, "and open that door and run back to my home. You shan't keep me from my own dear mother, you wicked woman." "Nobody wants to keep you," the old lady said. "You came of your own accord. Find the keys if you want to go back." That was true, and Clara wisely did not answer. But you can fancy how she regretted coming. She began to search among the dump heaps. She could find no keys, but the longer she hunted, the more determined she grew. It seemed to her that she searched for weeks and weeks. It was very discouraging, very dirty, and very fatiguing work. She moved always in a cloud of dust. At times it seemed as if her back would break from bending so much. Often she had to bite her lips to keep from screaming with rage after she had gone through a rubbish pile as high as her head, and still no keys. All kinds of venomous insects stung her. All kinds of vines and brambles scratched her. All kinds of stickers and thistles pricked her. Her little feet and hands bled all the time. But still she kept at it. After that first conversation, Clara never spoke with the old lady again. After a few days, Clara left her in the distance. At the end of a week, the moon door was no longer in sight when Clara looked back. But during all those weeks of weary work, Clara had a chance to think. She saw for the first time what a naughty little girl she had been, and how she had worried the kindest mother in the world. Her longing for her mother grew so great at times that she had to sit down and cry. But after a while, she would dry her eyes and go at the hunt with fresh determination. One day, she caught a glint of something shining from a clump of bushes. She had to dig and dig to get at it, for about these bushes the ashes were packed down hard. But finally, she uncovered a pair of iron keys. On one was printed in letters of gold, "I'm sorry." On the other, "I'll never do so again." Clara seized the keys joyfully and ran all the long way back to the great door. It had 2 locks. She put one key in the upper lock, turned it. A great bolt jarred. She put the other key in the second lock, turned it. A great bolt jarred. The door swung open. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered to herself. "I'll never do so again." She had a feeling that as long as she had said those magic words, everything would go well with her. Extending out from the door was the wake of gold. Clara bounded through the opening and ran. She turned back after a few moments, and there was the old lady with her cat and her broomstick standing in the doorway. But the old lady's face had grown very gentle and kind. Clara did not look long. She ran as fast as she could pelt across the golden path, whispering, "I'm sorry, I will never do so again. I'm sorry, I will never do so again. I'm sorry, I will never do so again." And as she ran, all the little merpeople came to the surface of the water to encourage her. The little mermaidens flashed their mirrors at her. The little merboys played wonderful music on their harps. The Mer-King gave her a jolly smile, and the Mer-Queen blew her a kiss. All the little mer-princesses and all the little mer-princes held up their pets to her. Even the mer-baby clapped her dimpled hands. And farther on, all the little seahorses with the sea urchins on their backs assembled in bobbing groups. And farther on, all the little rainbow fishes gathered in shining files. As she ran, all the scratches and gashes in her flesh healed up. After a while, she reached her own window. Opening it, she jumped in. Turning to pull it down, she saw the old lady disappear from the doorway of the moon, saw the door close upon her, saw the wake of gold melt and fall into the sea, where it lay in a million gleaming spangles, saw the moon float up into the sky, growing smaller and smaller and paler, until it was no larger than a silver plate. And now it was the moon no longer. It was the sun. Its rays were shining hot on her face. She was back in her little bed. Her mother's arms were about her, and Clara was saying, "I'm sorry. I will never do so again." For a long time after Billy finished, the room was very quiet. Then suddenly, Rosie jumped to her feet. "That was a lovely story, Billy," she said. "But I guess I don't want to hear any more now. I think I'll go home." Chapter 9. Work. It was still raining when Maida got up the next day. It rained all the morning. She listened carefully at 11:45 for the 1 session bell, but it did not ring. Just before school began in the afternoon, Rosie came into the shop. Maida saw at once that something had happened to her. Rosie's face looked strange, and she dragged across the room instead of pattering with her usual quick, light step. "What do you think's happened, Maida?" Rosie asked. "I don't know." "Oh, what?" Maida asked, affrighted. "When I came home from school this noon, Mother wasn't there, but Aunt Teresa was there. She'd cooked the dinner. She said that Mother had gone away for a visit and that she wouldn't be back for some time. She said she was going to keep house for Father and me while Mother was gone. I feel dreadfully homesick and lonesome without Mother." "Oh, Rosie, I'm sorry," Maida said, "but perhaps your mother won't stay long. Do you like your Aunt Teresa?" "Oh, yes, I like her, but of course she isn't Mother." "No, of course, nobody's like your mother." "Oh, yes, there's something else I had to tell you. The WMNTs are going to meet at Dickie's after school this afternoon. Be sure to come, Maida." "Of course I'll come." Maida's whole face sparkled. "That is, if Granny doesn't think it's too wet." Rosie lingered for a few moments, but she did not seem like her usual happy-go-lucky self. And when she left, Maida noticed that instead of running across the street, she actually walked. All the morning long, Maida talked of nothing to Granny but the prospective meeting of the WMNTs. "Just think, Granny, I've never belonged to a club before," she said again and again. Very early, she had put out on her bed the clothes that she intended to wear. A tan-brown serge of which she was particularly fond, and her favorite tire of a delicate, soft lawn. She kept rushing to the window to study the sky. It continued to look like the inside of a dull tin cup. She would not have eaten any lunch at all if Granny had not told her that she must. And her heart sank steadily all the afternoon, for the rain continued to come down. "I don't suppose I can go, Granny," she faltered when the clock struck 4. "Sure you can," Granny responded briskly. But she wrapped Maida up, as Maida herself said, as if I was one of Papa's carved crystals come all the way from China. First Granny put on a sweater, then a coat, then over all a raincoat. She put a hood on her head and a veil over that. She made her wear rubber boots and take an umbrella. Maida got into a gale of laughter during the dressing. "I ought to be wrapped in excelsior now," she said. "If I fall down in the puddle in the court, Granny," she threatened merrily, "I never can pick myself up. I'll either have to roll and roll and roll until I get on to dry land, or I'll have to wait until somebody comes and shovels me out." But she did not fall into the puddle. She walked carefully along the edge, and then ran as swiftly as her clothes and lameness would permit. She arrived in Dickie's garret, red-cheeked and breathless. Arthur and Rosie had already come. Rosie was playing on the floor with Delia and the puppy that she had rescued from the tin can persecution. Rosie was growling, the dog was yelping, and Delia was squealing, but all three with delight. Arthur and Dickie sat opposite each other, working at the round table. "What do you think of that dog now, Maida?" Rosie asked proudly. "His name is Tag. You wouldn't know him for the same dog, would you? Isn't he a nice-looking little puppy?" Tag did look like another dog. He wore a collar, and his yellowy coat shone like satin. His whole manner had changed. He came running over to Maida and stood looking at her with the most spirited air in the world, his head on one side, one paw up, and one ear cocked inquisitively. His tail wriggled so fast that Delia, thinking it some wonderful new toy, kept trying to catch it and hold it in her little fingers. "He's a lovely doggy," Maida said. "I wish I'd brought Fluff." "And did you ever see such a dear baby?" Rosie went on, hugging Delia. "Oh, if only I had a baby brother or sister." "She's a darling," Maida agreed heartily. "Babies are so much more fun than dolls, don't you think so, Rosie?" "Dolls?" No words can express the contempt that was in Miss Bryant's accent. "What are you doing, Dickie?" Maida asked, limping over to the table. "Making things," Dickie said cheerfully. On the table were piles of mysteriously looking objects made entirely of paper. Some were of white paper and others of brown, but they were all decorated with trimmings of colored tissue. "What are they?" Maida asked. "Aren't they lovely? I never saw anything like them in my life." Dickie blushed all over his face at this compliment, but it was evident that he was delighted. "Well, those are paper boxes," he said, pointing to the different piles of things. "And those are steamships. Those are the old-fashioned kind with double smokestacks. Those are double boats, jackets, pants, badges, nose pinchers, lamplighters, firemen's caps, and soldiers' caps." "Oh, that's why you buy all that colored paper," Maida said in a tone of great satisfaction. "I've often wondered." She examined Dickie's work carefully. She could see that it was done with remarkable precision and skill. "Oh, what fun to do things like that. I do wish you'd show me how to make them, Dickie. I'm such a useless girl. I can't make a single thing." "I'll show you, sure," Dickie offered generously. "What are you making so many for?" Maida queried. "Well, you see, it's this way," Dickie began in a businesslike air. "Arthie and Rosie and I are going to have a fair. We've had a fair every spring and every fall for the last 3 years. That's how we get our money for Christmas and the 4th of July. Arthur whittles things out of wood. He'll show you what he can do in a minute. He's a crackerjack. Rosie makes candy, and I make these paper things." "And do you make much money?" Maida asked, deeply interested. "Don't make any money at all," Dickie said. "The children pay us in nails. I charge them 10 nails apiece for the easy things, and 20 nails for the hardest. Arthur can get more for his stuff because it's harder to do." "But what do you want nails for?" Maida asked in bewilderment. "Why, nails are junk." "And what's junk?" The 3 children stared at her. "Don't you know what junk is, Maida?" Rosie asked in despair. "No." "Junk's old iron," Dickie explained, "and you sell it to the junk man. Once we made 40 cents out of one of these fairs. One reason we're beginning so early this year, I've got something very particular I want to buy my mother for a Christmas present. Can you keep a secret, Maida?" Maida nodded. "Well, it's a fur collar for her neck. They have them down in a store on Main Street every winter. $2.98. It seems an awful lot, but I've gotten over $1 saved up, and I guess I can do it if I work hard." "How much have you made ordinarily?" Maida asked thoughtfully. "Once we made 40 cents apiece, but that's the most." "I tell you what you do," Maida burst out impetuously, after a moment of silence in which she considered this statement. When the time comes for you to hold your fair, I'll lend you my shop for a day. I'll take all the things out of the window, and I'll clean all the shelves off, and you boys can put your things there. I'll clear out the showcases for Rosie's candy. Won't that be lovely?" She smiled happily. "It would be grand business for us," Dickie said soberly, "but somehow it doesn't seem quite fair to you." "Oh, please don't think of that," Maida said. "I'd just love to do it, and you must teach me how to make things so I can help you." "You will take the shop, Dickie," she pleaded. "And you, Rosie, and Arthur?" She looked from one to the other with all her heart in her eyes. But nobody spoke for a moment. "It seems somehow as if we oughtn't to," Dickie said awkwardly at last. Maida's lip trembled. At first, she could not understand. Here she was aching to do a kindness to these 3 friends of hers, and they, for some unknown reason, would not permit it. It was not that they disliked her, she knew. What was it? She tried to put herself in their place. Suddenly, it came to her what the difficulty was. They did not want to be so much in her debt. How could she prevent that? She must let them do something for her that would lessen that debt. But what? She thought very hard. In a flash, it came to her, a plan by which she could make it all right. "You see," she began eagerly, "I wanted to ask you 3 to help me in something, but I can't do it unless you let me help you. Listen, the next holiday is Halloween. I want to decorate my shop with a lot of real jack-o'-lanterns cut from pumpkins. It will be hard work, and a lot of it, and I was hoping that perhaps you'd help me with this." The 3 faces lighted up. "Of course we will," Dickie said heartily. "Gee, I bet Dickie and I could make some great lanterns," Arthur said reflectively. "And I'll help you fix up the store," Rosie said with enthusiasm. "I just love to make things look pretty." "It's a bargain then," Maida said. "And now you must teach me how to help you this very afternoon, Dickie." They fell to work with a vim. At least 3 of them did. Rosie continued to frisk with Delia and tag on the floor. Dickie started Maida on the caps first. He said that those were the easiest, and, indeed, she had very little trouble with anything until she came to the boxes. She had to do her first box over and over again before it would come right, but Dickie was very patient with her. He kept telling her that she did better than most beginners, or she would have given up. When she made her first good box, her face beamed with satisfaction. "Do you mind if I take it home, Dickie?" she asked. "I'd like to show it to my father when he comes. It's the first thing I ever made in my life." "Of course," Dickie said. "Don't the other children ever try to copy your things?" Maida asked. "They try to," Arthur answered, "but they never do so well as Dickie." "You ought to see their nose pinchers," Rosie laughed. "They can't stand up straight, and their boxes and steamships are the wobbliest things." "I'm going to get all kinds of stuff for things we make for the fair," Maida said reflectively. "Gold and silver paper, and colored stars, and pretty fancy pictures for trimmings. You see, if you're going to charge real money, you must make them more beautiful than those for which you only charged nails." "That's right," Dickie said. "By George, that will be great. You go ahead and buy whatever you think is right, Maida, and I'll pay you for it from what we take in at the fair." "That's settled." "What do you whittle, Arthur?" "Oh, all kinds of things. Things I made up myself and things I learned how to do in Sloyd in school. I make breadboards and rolling pins and shinny sticks and cats and little baskets out of cherry stones." "Jiminy crickets, he's forgetting the boats," Dickie burst in enthusiastically. "He makes the dandiest boats you ever saw in your life." Maida looked at Arthur in awe. "I never heard anything like it. Can you make anything for girls?" "Made me a set of the sweetest doll's furniture you ever saw in your life," Rosie put in from the floor. "Say, did you get in any trouble last night?" Arthur turned suddenly to Rosie. "I forgot to ask you." "Arthur and Rosie hooked Jack yesterday in all that rain," Dickie explained to Maida. "They knew a place where they could get a whole lot of old iron, and they were afraid if they waited it would be gone." "I should say I did," Rosie answered Arthur's question. "Somebody went and tattled to my mother. Of course, I was wet through to the skin, and that gave the whole thing away anyway. I got the worst scolding, and Mother sent me to bed without my supper. But I climbed out of the window and went over to see Maida. I don't mind. I hate school, and as long as I live, I shall never go except when I want to. Never, never, never. I guess I'm not going to be shut up studying when I'd rather be out in the open air. Wouldn't you hook Jack if you wanted to, Maida?" Maida did not reply for an instant. She hated to have Rosie ask this question point blank, for she did not want to answer it. If she said exactly what she thought, there might be trouble, and it seemed to her that she would do almost anything rather than lose Rosie's friendship. But Maida had been taught to believe that the truth is the most precious thing in the world, and so she told the truth after a while, but it was with a great effort. "No, I wouldn't," she said. "Oh, that's all right for you to say," Rosie said, firing up. "You don't have to go to school. You live the easiest life that anybody can, just sitting in a chair and tending shop all day. What do you know about it anyway?" Maida's lip quivered. "It is true I don't go to school, Rosie," she said. "But it isn't because I don't want to. I'd give anything on earth if I could go. I watch that line of children every morning and afternoon of my life, and wish and wish and wish I was in it. And when the windows are opened, and I hear the singing and reading, it seems as if I just couldn't stand it." "Oh well," Rosie's tone was still scornful. "I don't believe, even if you did go to school, that you'd ever do anything bad. You'd be anything but a frayed cat and teacher's pet." "I guess I'd be so glad to be there. I'd do anything the teacher asked," Maida said dejectedly. "I do a lot of things that bother Granny, but I guess I never have been a very naughty girl." "You can't be very naughty with your leg all crooked under you." Maida's voice had grown bitter. The children looked at her in amazement. "But what's the use of talking to you two?" she went on. "You could never understand. I guess Dickie knows what I mean, though." To their great surprise, Maida put her head down on the table and cried. For a moment, the room was perfectly silent. The fire snapped, and Dickie went over to look at it. He stood with his back turned to the other children, but a suspicious snuffle came from his direction. Arthur Duncan walked to the window and stood looking out. Rosie sat still, her eyes downcast, her little white teeth biting her red lips. Then suddenly she jumped to her feet, ran like a whirlwind to Maida's side. She put her arms about the bowed figure. "Oh, do excuse me, Maida," she begged. "I know I'm the worst girl in the world. Everybody says so, and I guess it's true. But I do love you, and I wouldn't have hurt your feelings for anything. I don't believe you'd be a frayed cat or teacher's pet. I truly don't. Please excuse me." Maida wiped her tears away. "Of course I'll excuse you. But just the same, Rosie, I hope you won't hook Jack any more, for someday you'll be sorry." "I'm going to make some candy now," Rosie said, changing the subject. I brought some molasses and butter and everything I need." She began to bustle about the stove. Soon they were all laughing again. Maida had never pulled candy before, and she thought it the most enchanting fun in the world. It was hard to keep at work, though, when it was such a temptation to stop and eat it. But she persevered and succeeded in pulling hers whiter than anybody's. She laughed and talked so busily that, when she started to put on her things, all traces of tears had disappeared. The rain had stopped. The puddle was of monster size after so long a storm. They came out just in time to help Molly fish Tim out of the water and to prevent Betsy from giving a stray kitten a bath. Following Rosie and Arthur, Maida waded through it from one end to the other. It seemed the most perilous of adventures to her. After that meeting, the WMNTs were busier than they'd ever been. Every other afternoon, and always when it was bad weather, they worked at Maida's house. Granny gave Maida a closet all to herself, and as fast as the things were finished, they were put in boxes and stowed away on its shelves. Arthur whittled and carved industriously. His work went slower than Dickie's, of course, but still it went with remarkable quickness. Maida often stopped her own work on the paper things to watch Arthur's. It was such a constant marvel to her that such big, awkward-looking hands could perform feats of such delicacy. Her own fingers, small and delicate as they were, bungled surprisingly at times. And as for the paste, Maida said in disgust to Rosie one day, "You'd think that I fell into the paste pot every day. I wash it off my hands and face. I pick it off my clothes, and sometimes Granny combs it out of my hair." Often after dinner, the WMNTs would call in a body on Maida. Then would follow long hours of such fun that Maida hated to hear the clock strike 9. Always there would be molasses candy making by the capable Rosie at the kitchen stove, and corn popping by the vigorous Arthur on the living room hearth. After the candy had cooled and the popcorn had been flooded in melted butter, they would gather about the hearth to roast apples and chestnuts and to listen to the fairy tales that Maida would read. The one thing which she could do and they could not was to read with the ease and expression of a grown person. As many of her books were in French as in English, and it was the wonder of the other WMNTs that she could read a French story, translating as she went. Her books were a delight to Arthur and Dickie, and she lent them freely. Rosie liked to listen to stories, but she did not care to read. Maida was very happy nowadays. Laura was the only person in the court who had caused her any uneasiness. Since the day that Laura had made herself so disagreeable, Maida had avoided her steadily. Best of all, perhaps, Maida's health had improved so much that even her limp was slowly disappearing. In the course of time, the children taught Maida the secret language of the WMNTs. They could hold long conversations that were unintelligible to anybody else. When at first they used it in fun before Maida, she could not understand a word. After they had explained it to her, she wondered that she had ever been puzzled. Billy Potter was finally invited to join the WMNTs too. He never missed a meeting if he could possibly help it. "Why do you call Maida Petronilla?" Dickie asked him curiously one day when Maida had run home for more paper. "Petronilla is the name of a little girl in a fairy tale that I read when I was a little boy," Billy answered. "And was she like Maida?" Arthur asked. "Very." "How?" Rosie inquired. "Petronilla had a gold star set in her forehead by a fairy when she was a baby," Billy explained. "It was a magic star. Nobody but fairies could see it, but it was always there. Anybody who came within the light of Petronella's star, no matter how wicked or hopeless or unhappy he was made better and happier. Nobody spoke for an instant. "Then I guess Maida's got the star all right," Dickie said. Chapter 10. Play. But although the WMNTs worked very hard, you must not suppose that they left no time to play. Indeed, the weather was so fine that it was hard to stay in the house. The beautiful Indian summer had come, and each new day dawned more perfect than the last. The trees had become so gorgeous that it was as if the streets were lined with burning torches. Whenever a breeze came, they seemed to flicker and flame and flare. Maida and Rosie used to shuffle along the gutters, gathering pockets full of glossy horse chestnuts and handfuls of gorgeous leaves. Sometimes it seemed to Maida that she did not need to play, that there was fun enough in just being out of doors. But she did play a great deal, for she was well enough to join in all the fun now, and it seemed to her that she could never get enough of any one game. She would play house and paper dolls and ring games with the little children in the morning when the older ones were in school. She would play jackstones with the bigger girls in the afternoon. She would play running games with the crowd of girls and boys of whom the WMNTs were the leaders towards night. Then sometimes she would grumble to Granny because the days were so short. Of all the games, Hoist the Sail was her favorite. She often served as captain on her side, but whether she called or awaited the cry, "Liberty poles are bending, hoist the sail," a thrill ran through her that made her blood dance. "It's no use in talking, Granny," Maida said joyfully one day. "My leg is getting stronger. I jumped 20 jumps today without stopping." After that, her progress was rapid. She learned to jump in the rope with Rosie. They were a pretty sight. People passing often gave them more than one glance. Rosie so vivid and sparkling in the scarlet cape, Maida slim, delicate, fairy-like in her long squirrel coat and cap, her airy ringlets streaming in the breeze, and the eyes that had once been so wistful now shining with happiness. "Do you know what you look like, Maida?" Rosie said once. Before Maida could answer, she went on, "You look like the little mermaid princess in Andersen's fairy tales, the one who had to suffer so to get legs like mortals." "Do I?" Maida laughed. "Now isn't it strange? I have always thought that you look like somebody in a fairy tale too. You're like Rose Red in Rose Red and Snow White. I think," she added, flushing, for she was a little afraid that it was not polite to say things like this, "that you are the beautifulest girl I ever saw." "Why, that's just what I think of you," Rosie said in surprise. "I just love black hair," Maida said. "And I just adore golden hair," Rosie said. "Now isn't that strange?" "I guess," Maida announced after a moment of thought. "People like what they haven't got." After a while, Rosie taught Maida to jump in the big rope with half a dozen children at once. Maida never tired of this. When she heard the rope swishing through the air, a kind of excitement came over her. She was proud to think that she had caught the trick, that something inside would warn her when to jump, that she could be sure that this warning would not come an instant too soon or too late. The consciousness of a new strength and new power made a different child of her. It made her eyes sparkle like gray diamonds. It made her cheeks glow like pink peonies. By this time, she could spin tops with the best of them. Sometimes she had 5 tops going at once. This was a sport of which the WMNTs never tired. They kept it up long into the twilight. Sometimes Granny would have to ring the dinner bell a half a dozen times before Maida appeared. Maida did not mean to be disobedient. She simply did not hear the bell. Granny's scoldings for this carelessness were very gentle. Maida's face was too radiant with her triumph in this new skill. There was something about Primrose Court. The rows of trees welded into a yellow arch high over their heads. The sky showing through in diamond-shaped glints of blue, the tiny trim houses and their tinier, trimmer yards, the doves pink-toeing everywhere, their throats bubbling color as wonderful as the old Venetian glass in the Beacon Street house. The children running and shouting, the very smell of the dust which their pattering feet threw up. Something in the look of all this made Maida's spirits leap. "I'm happy, happy, happy," Maida said one day. The next, Rosie came rushing into the shop with a frightened face. "Oh, Maida," she panted, "a terrible thing has happened. Laura Lathrop's got diphtheria. They say she's going to die." "Oh, Rosie, how dreadful. Who told you so?" "Annie, the cook, told Aunt Teresa. Dr. Ames went there 3 times yesterday. Annie says Mrs. Lathrop looks something awful." "The poor, poor woman," Granny murmured compassionately. "Oh, I'm so sorry I was cross to Laura," Maida said. "Oh, I do hope she won't die." "It must be dreadful for Laura," Rosie continued. "Harold can't go near her. Nobody goes into the room but her mother and the nurse." The news cast a deep gloom over the court. The little children, Betsy, Molly, and Tim, played as usual, for they could not understand the situation. But the noisy fun of the older children ceased entirely. They gathered on the corner and talked in low voices, watching with dread any movement in the Lathrop house. For a week or more, Primrose Court was the quietest spot in the neighborhood. "They say she's sinking," Rosie said that first night. The thought of it colored Maida's dreams. "She's got through the night all right," Rosie reported in the morning, her face shining with hope, "and they think she's a little better." But late the next afternoon, Rosie appeared again, her face dark with dread. "Laura's worse again." 2 or 3 days passed. Sometimes Laura was better, oftener she was worse. Dr. Ames' carriage seemed always to be driving into the court. "Annie says she's dying," Rosie retailed despairingly. "They don't think she'll live through the night." "Oh, won't it be dreadful to wake up tomorrow and find the crepe on the door?" The thought of what she might see in the morning kept Maida awake a long time that night. When she arose, her first glance was for the Lathrop door. There was no crepe. "No better," Rosie dropped in to say on her way to school. "But," she added hopefully, "she's no worse." Maida watched the Lathrop house all day, dreading to see the undertaker's wagon drive up, but it did not come, not that day, nor the next, nor the next. "They think she's getting better," Rosie reported joyfully one day. And gradually, Laura did get better, but it was many days before she was well enough to sit up. "Mrs. Lathrop says," Rosie burst in one day with an excited face, "that if we all gather in front of the house tomorrow at 1 o'clock, she'll lift Laura up to the window so that we can see her. She says Laura is crazy to see us all." "Oh, Rosie, I'm so glad," Maida exclaimed, delighted. Seizing each other by the waist, the two little girls danced about the room. "Oh, I'm going to be so good to Laura when she gets well," Maida said. "So am I," Rosie declared. "The last thing I ever said to her was that she was a hateful little smarty cat." 5 minutes before 1 the next day, all the children in Primrose Court gathered on the lawn in front of Laura's window. Maida led Molly by one hand and Tim by the other. Rosie led Betsy and Delia. Dorothy Clark held Fluff and Mabel held Tag. Promptly at 1 o'clock, Mrs. Lathrop appeared at the window, carrying a little thin white wisp of a girl, all muffled up in a big shawl. The children broke into shouts of joy. The boys waved their hats and the girls their handkerchiefs. Tag barked madly, and Rosie declared afterwards that even Fluff looked excited. But Maida stood still with the tears streaming down her cheeks. Laura's face looked so tiny, her eyes so big and sad. From her own experience, Maida could guess how weak Laura felt. Laura stayed only an instant at the window. One feeble wave of her claw-like hand, and she was gone. "Annie says Mrs. Lathrop is worn to a shadow, trying to find things to entertain Laura," Rosie said one night to Maida and Billy Potter. "She's read all her books to her and played all her games with her, and Laura keeps saying she wished she had something new. Oh, I do wish we could think of something to do for her," Maida said wistfully. "I know just how she feels. If I could only think of a new toy, but Laura has everything. And then the trouble with toys is that after you've played with them once, there's no more fun in them. I know what that is. If we all had telephones, we could talk to her once in a while, but even that would tire her, I guess." Billy jumped. "I know what we can do for Laura," he said. "I'll have to have Mrs. Lathrop's permission, though." He seized his hat and made for the door. "I'd better see her about it tonight." The door slammed. It had all happened so suddenly that the children gazed after him with wide open mouths and eyes. "What do you suppose it's going to be, Maida?" Rosie asked finally. "I don't know," Maida answered. "I haven't the least idea. But if Billy makes it, you may be sure it will be wonderful." When Billy came back, they asked him 100 questions, but they could not get a word out of him in regard to the new toy. He appeared at the shop early the next morning with a suitcase full of bundles. Then followed doings that, for a long time, were a mystery to everybody. A crowd of excited children followed him about, asking him dozens of questions and chattering frantically among themselves. First, he opened one of the bundles. Out dropped 8 little pulleys. Second, he went up into Maida's bedroom and fastened one of the little pulleys on the sill outside her window. Third, he did the same thing in Rosie's house, in Arthur's and in Dickie's. Fourth, he fastened 4 of the little pulleys at the playroom window in the Lathrop house. "Oh, what is he doing? I can't think of anything. Oh, I wish he'd tell us," came from the children who watched these maneuvers from the street. Fifth, Billy opened another bundle. This time, out came 4 coils of a thin rope. "I know now," Arthur called up to him, "but I won't tell." Billy grinned. And, sure enough, "You watch him," was all Arthur would say to the entreaties of his friends. Sixth, Billy ran a double line of rope between Maida's and Laura's window, a second between Rosie's and Laura's, and a third between Arthur's and Laura's, and a fourth between Dickie's and Laura's. Last, Billy opened another bundle. Out dropped 4 square tin boxes, each with a cover and a handle. "I've guessed it! I've guessed it!" Maida and Rosie screamed together. "It's a telephone." "That's the answer," Billy confessed. He went from house to house, fastening a box to the lower rope. "Now, when you want to say anything to Laura," he said on his return, "just write a note, put it in the box, pull on the upper string, and it will sail over to her window. Suppose you all run home and write something now. I'll go over to Laura's to see how it works." The children scattered. In a few moments, 4 excited little faces appeared at as many windows. The telephone worked perfectly. Billy handed Mrs. Lathrop the notes to deliver to Laura. "Oh, Mr. Potter," Mrs. Lathrop said suddenly, "there's a matter that I wish to speak to you about. That little Flynn girl has lived in the family of Mr. Jerome Westabrook, hasn't she?" Billy's eyes shrinkled up. "Yes, Mrs. Lathrop," he admitted. "She lived in the Westabrook family for several years." "So I guessed," Mrs. Lathrop said. "She's a very sweet little girl," she went on earnestly, for she had been touched by the sight of Maida's grief the day that she held Laura to the window. "I hope Mr. Westabrook's own little girl is as sweet." "She is, Mrs. Lathrop. I assure you she is," Billy said gravely. "What is the name of the Westabrook child?" "Elizabeth Fairfax Westabrook." "What is she like?" "She's a good deal like Maida," Billy said, his eyes beginning to sprinkle up again. They could easily pass for sisters. "I suppose that's why the Westabrooks have been so good to the little Flynn girl," Mrs. Lathrop went on, "for they certainly are very good to her. It is quite evident that Maida's clothes belonged once to the little Westabrook girl." "You are quite right, Mrs. Lathrop. They were made for the little Westabrook girl." Mrs. Lathrop always declared afterwards that it was the telephone that really cured Laura. Certainly, it proved to be the most exciting of toys to the little invalid. There was always something waiting for her when she waked up in the morning, and the tin boxes kept bobbing from window to window until long after dark. The girls kept her informed of what was going on in the neighborhood, and the boys sent her jokes and conundrums and puzzle pictures cut from the newspapers. Gifts came to her at all hours. Sometimes it would be a bit of wood carving, a grotesque face, perhaps that Arthur had done. Sometimes it was a bit of Dickie's pretty paper work. Rosie sent her specimens of her cooking, from candy to hot roasted potatoes, and Maida sent her daily translations of an exciting fairy tale which she was reading in French for the first time. Pretty soon, Laura was well enough to answer the notes herself. She wrote each of her correspondents a long, grateful, and affectionate letter. By and by, she was able to sit in a chair at the window and watch the games. The children remembered every few moments to look and wave to her and she always waved back. At last came the morning when a very thin, pale Laura was wheeled out into the sunshine. After that, she grew well by leaps and bounds. In a day or two, she could stand in the ring games with the little children. By the end of a week, she seemed quite herself. One morning, every child in Primrose Court received a letter in the mail. It was written on gay tinted paper with a pretty picture at the top. It read, "You are cordially invited to a Halloween party to be given by Miss Laura Lathrop at 29 Primrose Court on Saturday evening, October 31st at 7:30. But as Maida ceased gradually to worry about Laura, she began to be troubled about Rosie. For Rosie was not the same child. Much of the time she was silent, moody, and listless. One afternoon, she came over to the shop, bringing the Clark twins with her. For a while, she and Maida played house with the little girls. Suddenly, Rosie tired of this game and sent the children home. Then, for a time, she frolicked with Fluff while Maida read aloud. As suddenly as she had stopped playing house, she interrupted Maida. "Don't read any more," she commanded. "I want to talk with you." Maida had felt the whole afternoon that there was something on Rosie's mind, for whenever the scowl came between Rosie's eyebrows, it meant trouble. Maida closed her book and sat waiting. "Maida," Rosie asked, "do you remember your mother?" "Oh, yes," Maida answered. "Perfectly. She was very beautiful. I could not forget her any more than a wonderful picture. She used to come and kiss me every night before she went to dinner with Papa. She always smelled so sweet. Whenever I see any flowers, I think of her. And she wore such beautiful dresses and jewels. She loved sparkly things. I guess sometimes she looked like a fairy queen. Once, she had a new lace gown all made of roses of lace, and she had a diamond fastened in every rose to make it look like dew. When her hair was down, it came to her knees. She let me brush it sometimes with her gold brush." "A gold brush?" Rosie said in an odd tone. "Yes, it was gold with her initials and diamonds on it. Papa gave her a whole set one birthday." "How old were you when she died?" Rosie asked after a pause in which her scowl grew deeper. 8. "And what did she die of?" "I don't know," Maida answered. "You see, I was so little that I didn't understand about dying. I had never heard of it. They told me one day that my mother had gone away. I used to ask every day when she was coming back, and they'd say next week, and next week, and next week, until one day I got so impatient that I cried. Then they told me that my mother was living far away in a beautiful country, and she would never come back. They said that I must not cry, for she loved me and was always watching over me. It was a great comfort to know that, and of course I never cried after that for the fear of worrying her. But at first it was very lonely." "Why, Rosie?" She stopped, terrified. "What's the matter?" Rosie had thrown herself on the couch and was crying bitterly. "Oh, Maida," she sobbed. "That's exactly what they say to me when I ask them. Next week, and next week, and next week, until I'm sick of it. My mother is dead, I know it." "Oh, Rosie," Maida protested. "Oh, no, no, no. Your mother's not dead. I can't believe it. I won't believe it." She is, Rosie persisted. I know she is. Oh, what shall I do? Think how naughty I was. What shall I do? She sobbed so convulsively that Maida was frightened. Listen, Rosie, she said. You don't know your mother is dead, and I for one don't believe that she is. But they said the same thing to you, Rosie protested passionately. I think it was because I was sick, Maida said after a moment in which she thought the matter out. They were afraid that I might die if they told me the truth. But whether your mother is alive or dead, the only way you can make up for being naughty is to be as good to your Aunt Teresa as you can. Oh, Rosie, please go to school every day. Do you suppose I could ever hook Jack again? Rosie asked bitterly. She dried her eyes. I guess I'll go home now, she said, and see if I can help Aunt Teresa with supper. And I'm going to get her to teach me how to cook everything so that I can help Mother if she ever comes home. The next day, Rosie came into the shop with the happiest look that she had worn for a long time. I peeled the potatoes for Aunt Teresa last night, she announced, and set the table and wiped the dishes. She was real surprised. She asked me what had gotten into me. I'm glad, Maida approved. I asked her when Mother was coming back, and she said the same thing. Next week, I think. Rosie's lip quivered. I think she'll come back, Rosie, Maida insisted. And now let's not talk any more about it. Let's come out to play. Mindful of her own lecture on obedience to Rosie, Maida skipped home the first time Granny rang the bell. Granny met her at the door. Her eyes were shining with mischief. You've got a visitor, she said. Maida could see that she was trying to keep her lips prim at the corners. She wondered who it was. Could it be? She ran into the living room. Her father jumped up from the easy chair to meet her. Well, 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 Miss Rosy Cheeks. No need to ask how you are, he said, kissing her. Oh, Papa, Papa, I never was so happy in all my life. If you could only be here with me all the time, there wouldn't be another thing in the world that I wanted. Don't you think you could give up Wall Street and come to live in this court? You might open a shop too, Papa. I know you'd make a good shopkeeper, although it isn't so easy as a lot of people think. But I teach you all I know, and then it's such fun. You can have a big shop, for I know just how you like big things, just as I like little ones. Buffalo Westabrook laughed. I may have to come to it yet, but it doesn't look like it this moment. My gracious Posy, how you've improved. I never would know you for the same child. Where did you get those dimples? I never saw them in your face before. Your mother had them, though. The shadow that the mention of her mother's name always brought darkened his face. How you are growing to look like her, he said. Maida knew that she must not let him stay sad. Dimples, she squealed. Really, Papa? She ran over to the mirror, climbed up on a chair, and peeked in. Her face fell. I don't see any, she said mournfully. And you're losing your limp, Mr. Westabrook said. Then catching sight of her woe-begone face, he laughed. That's because you've stopped smiling, you little goose, he said. Grin, and you'll see them. Obedient, Maida grinned so hard that it hurt, but the grin softened to a smile of perfect happiness, for, sure enough, pricking through the round of her soft pink cheeks were a pair of tiny hollows. And so, in your own time and in your own way, you can drift off into a restful, sound sleep while enjoying a full night's rest. And you'll awaken feeling refreshed and wonderful in every way. Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well. Good night.